YouTube. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Rachel, the Student Witch. First of all, before I dive into the topic of this video and this series that I'm starting, I just want to say, there's a global pandemic still going on here in the Southern Hemisphere in South America, in Santiago, Chile. The number of cases is going up fast because we're in winter right now. This weekend is the winter solstice down here, and so I just hope that you and your loved ones are safe and well. Knock on wood. So far mine are, both here in Chile via my partner's family that I'm married into, but my family back up in the Northern Hemisphere in the US. So far so good, and I hope that's the case with you as well. Many of my fellow white, witchy, pagan YouTubers / people who have like an online presence within some sort of like a alternative spiritual community, alternative spirituality or spiritual practice, I've been thinking about what can I do? What can I do to contribute to the current Black Lives Matter movement, the current calls for justice for all of the people who have been murdered by the police in the US but also abroad. Particularly black people being targeted by the police within the US and internationally. It happens here in Chile too. Besides using my platform to spread awareness and resources, and besides donating money whichever way I can, and since I'm not in the US, I can't go and physically protest, be on the streets, otherwise I would. Because I don't have any underlying health conditions, I don't have any children, it would be easier for me to be out on the street facing down the cops than for other people, but I'm thousands of miles away here in Chile in quarantine. So I've been thinking about what can I do, how can I contribute, and being that I am a PhD candidate, I'm writing my dissertation right now, and I study and I do research and I focus on precisely race and anti-blackness and white supremacy and colonialism and US imperialism, mostly within the Americas, North America, South America, the Caribbean, Central America, right? Since that is my area of expertise, I think that I can use my voice to spread knowledge and awareness, right? And I can point to resources, and I can help to define terms, and I can help kind of begin the conversation about anti-racist work and anti-colonial work. And I hope to kind of dissect the origins and roots of whiteness and white supremacy within colonialism, Western European colonialism, and now US imperialism and colonialism, right? And so just right off the bat, my goal with this series, and this is going to be a series, and this is actually the second time I've sat down to record this video, because the first time I realized at first I thought maybe I can make one video, and then I thought no, I have to split this into two, and now I'm realizing this is going to be a whole series on my channel. But one of the reasons why I want to sit down and talk more explicitly about colonialism in relation to racism and white supremacy is because I feel like that might be a little puzzle piece that, not that it's missing, but that it doesn't have enough light shining on it. Because as a white person from the global north, from the center of the US empire, right? I now live in South America, and I've spent significant time in Europe, and I can tell you I've experienced white privilege, and I've witnessed white supremacy everywhere, everywhere. And that is because of colonialism. And so I just want to, I want to shed some more light on that. I want to point people to resources so that they can kind of build their own vocabulary for talking about colonialism in relation to white supremacy and racism, right? So that way we can kind of better inform ourselves when we're doing anti-racist work, right? So that way we can also call it anti-colonial work. And I've seen other much more prominent white alternative spiritual witchy YouTubers using their platforms to call attention to this, making pledges about how they're going to like continue to teach and work on themselves, and work on white fragility, and do what we can to dismantle systemic oppression, particularly racism, anti-black racism, right? But I think if we're going to talk about what we can do about dismantling white supremacy and working on our own white fragility or our own like shadows, we need to talk about the origin of where these shadows, where does white supremacy come from? And I am an incredibly privileged person for many reasons. I guess just to give my quick like positionality statement, I'm white, I speak English as my native language, I'm able-bodied, I'm neurotypical, and another big source of my privilege is my access to academic resources, my level of education. And so, in general in my life, I try to kind of redistribute that knowledge, because academia itself is a very white supremacist, colonialist, or it's a product of colonialism. Academia in general as like an institution, there's a lot of gatekeeping, it's a very elitist kind of institution. And so I try to undermine that by sharing my knowledge, by sharing the resources I've been given, by sharing what I've learned, what I've had the privilege to learn. And so that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to make this kind of a contribution to the discussion, to the anti-racist work going on right now. I guess this might be a good time to talk about my credentials to talk about this, but also my limitations, because they're kind of one of the same. Because, I'm getting a PhD right now, and getting a PhD basically means you're an expert in this thing. You've gone down the deep rabbit hole focusing on this one thing, right? That doesn't mean you're an expert in everything. And so I just want to be clear with that, and I want to be clear about the limitations of this series, because, talking about colonialism and anti-colonialism and anti-racist work in relation to colonialism, entire academic fields of knowledge, for decades, if not hundreds of years, have talked about this and are dedicated to this. And that's just within the academy. Outside of the academy, you have generations upon generations of like boots on the ground Oh, that's like a Trumpy phrase, isn't it? Ugh. You know, bodies out in the street, like activist work, right? And so there's so much written, and the discussion about colonialism is so rich, and there's no way that I could cover all of it within this series. And so I really want to make this clear that the purpose of the series is just to give people a starting point to, you know, start to educate themselves about it, a starting point to start to learn the particularities of the colonial history of where they live, a starting point into the conversation. Like, that's the point of this series. And so I guess just to give my credentials, and I'm going to keep things kind of vague just to, like, you know, protect my identity and my research and whatnot, but basically I exist within a field of knowledge called ethnic studies. And ethnic studies is a field within academia, particularly within the U.S. I'm most familiar with that and with the history of ethnic studies in the U.S., so I'm going to situate what I'm about to say within that context, right? But ethnic studies is basically a field of knowledge that is, I would say, or I would characterize it as anti-colonial and anti-racist in nature, because it's a field of knowledge that points out the gaps and the silences and the erasing of other bodies of knowledge and sources of knowledge that happens when we're forced to just learn the Western canon, right? Western literature, Western science, Western mathematics, Western this or that. Because the Western canon, and this is, you know, in general, an example of Eurocentrism, right? The Western canon is taught as if it's universal, right? The Western perspective is universal. Western cultural beliefs are universal and forced on everybody else, right? That's colonialism in a nutshell, right? And so colonialism is alive and well in the academy. And so ethnic studies really has its roots within student activism, especially in the 1960s with the rise of second wave feminism and the civil rights movement, and a greater discussion about race and workers' rights. And so ethnic studies was kind of born out of that student activism of the 1960s to give students of color in particular a voice and a platform for them to point out how forcing the Western canon on everybody is it's colonialism. It's oppressive, right? And so ethnic studies is also by its nature very interdisciplinary. And so it's kind of an umbrella term, and within that umbrella you have, at least within the US, you have Asian and Asian American studies, Native and Indigenous studies, Muslim and Muslim American studies. You have African American or Black diasporic studies and departments. You have Latinx or US Latino studies or Latinx studies, and within that you even have, you know, Mexican American or Chicano or Chicanx studies, Dominican studies, Puerto Rican studies, you know. So those are like the major area studies, right? And then within that, a lot of the research involves other bodies of knowledge, such as post-colonial theory, queer of color critique, women's and gender studies and sexuality studies, immigration, research that focuses on immigration and immigration studies, carceral studies, or this, you know, studying prisons and policing practices. I mean, within ethnic studies and its kind of dialogues with and working with all these other bodies of knowledge, you know, you can be someone in the field of education, for example, that focuses on race and equity in education, and you can touch on this knowledge. You can be in a literature department and work with this kind of knowledge. You can be in a women's and gender studies department. You can be, it's so interdisciplinary, but it's also so essential and important. And it's in many parts and many universities in the United States, at least, it's under attack. And it's attacked by, professors being denied tenure, programs never really given any funding or structural support, these sorts of things. And usually the higher up you go, the more elite the institution, the shadier and more evil shit goes down. Just gonna leave it at that. So I am within the greater field of ethnic studies, but my research focuses more on the colonial history of Latin America and U.S. neo-colonial or imperialist actions in Latin America, right? Just speaking very, very generally here. And so my research does focus a lot on race and sexuality and queer of color critique or queer theory, immigration, and how immigration has been used as a tool for white supremacy within Latin America, but also between the US and Latin America. It's complicated, but that's basically what I specialize in. So as I go through this series, I'm going to use what I'm most familiar with and what I know as a way to kind of introduce and talk about these topics, because of course, even though I've written I've read post-colonial theorists writing from and talking about like post-colonial India, for example, I'm not a specialist in that. I'm not a specialist in British imperialism. I'm not a specialist in the colonial history of different parts of Asia, for example. I focus mainly on the Americas, and so I want to be explicit and open about that. And again, the point of this series is not to like cover everything or make wide, huge truth claims about like the colonial experience or decolonial or anti-colonial work. I just want to kind of bring attention to the lingering effects of European colonialism and U.S. imperialism / colonialism, and just shed some light and introduce these topics into the greater conversation of, Black Lives Matter and anti-racist work. And, decolonizing yourself, right? Which is a beautiful process, believe me. It's, a continuing, lifelong process, and damn, it feels good to be free from the bullshit. Anyway, that's probably a topic for a different kind of video, but that is the point of the series. That's my credentials and my area of expertise, but also my limitations. Some of the topics I want to touch on in this series include the origins of whiteness and white supremacy. I want to use the work of Sylvia Wynter. She's a Caribbean post-colonial theorist, writer from Jamaica. And I really like how she breaks down the origins of whiteness and white supremacy, and how she breaks down that white versus black kind of dialectic that is a result of colonialism. So I'm going to have a video breaking that down. I want to talk about colonialism in relation to modernity and colonialism in relation to basically the epistemology of Europe, or actually the history of ideas and philosophy in Europe, because I was always taught that the Renaissance was a sign of like human innovation and blah blah blah, but the Renaissance was happening as as European colonialism was going down. So European artistic movements European schools of thought, like how much of this that we're taught from inside the bubble is actually connected to what was happening outside the bubble, right? Was the Enlightenment possible without the wealth being extracted from the Americas and Africa and Asia, right? For example, I want to get into that. I want to talk more about U.S. imperialism, keeping in mind I live in Chile right now, and Chile from 1973 to 1990 had a military dictator that the United States helped to put into power, right? That's an example of U.S. imperialism. I want to talk more about Columbus. I'm not a scholar of Columbus. I'm not a medievalist. I'm not a specialist in medieval history or writing or early modern or early colonial writing or anything like that, but my research does touch on him, and I have read some of his writings and works attributed to him. I have done research involving Columbus, so I want to talk more in depth about him and the historical and socio-political influences that fed into his ideas about what he wanted to do, and the religious influences too. And I want to talk about why the year 1492 is significant, because it's not just because of his stumbling upon what we now call the Caribbean, right? 1492 within Europe is also particularly important, at least within the Iberian Peninsula, is a very important historical year, and that also fed into the construction of race and whiteness as we understand it to this day. So I want to talk more about that. I want to talk about science and scientific racism, again, kind of shedding light to how colonialism made artistic and economic and intellectual advancements within Europe possible because it financed it, right? And also I want to talk about U.S. colonialism in terms of the United States and its westward expansion and the U.S. as the colonial power. So these are just some of the topics I want to touch on, and again, I'm just going to touch on them. I don't want to present these ideas as if I'm the end-all, be-all resource about these sorts of things. I definitely want to just touch on them and spread knowledge and link a shit ton of resources in the description box and kind of give people the basic tools and vocabulary so they can start to build this knowledge within themselves and do the anti-racist and anti-colonial work within themselves, right? So I guess for the purposes of this video, since it's the introductory video, I want to break down what colonialism is, what imperialism is, what coloniality is, and I want to talk about prejudice and discrimination versus systemic racism, and I'll kind of finish this video off with just a rundown of the resources I'm including in the description box below for this video. So colonialism, basically the difference between imperialism and colonialism, right? And I'm not saying that everybody would agree with me on this, but this is how I make sense of it. Is that imperialism is kind of the theory, whereas colonialism is the practice. And so I'm borrowing this from Edward Said. He's a kind of post-colonial writer, thinker, scholar. His book, Orientalism, which came out in 1978, is kind of it's seen as a very foundational, almost canonical post-colonial text. Nowadays it's seen that way, right? It's not perfect, it's from 1978, but it's a very important book that came out, where he kind of pointed out how Europe and the West constructed this idea of itself based on difference and differing itself from the East. And that difference was based on a bunch of racism and stereotypes. That's why it's called Orientalism, right? The West constructing itself as the opposite of the East in this case, right? So he basically said that colonialism, or rather that imperialism, is the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center on a distant territory, whereas colonialism is the implanting of settlements on that distant territory. So that's why I mean by imperialism is more of the attitudes from the center of the empire focused on peoples and places outside the empire, whereas colonialism is the actual dirty work. It's the settler colonialism. It's sending people to live on and colonize. It's economic exploitation of natural resources and exploitation of slave labor in the case of, the colonialism that resulted from 1492. So that it's a subtle difference, but that's kind of the difference between colonialism and imperialism. Now, coloniality is a term that a lot of post-colonial scholars use, but in general, it's used to describe how, even after a nation might gain independence from the colonial power, how the power structures set up during the colonial period continue and are carried through independence and beyond. And so, one of the interesting things from my perspective as someone who does a lot of research and focuses on Latin America and the Americas in general, North and South, right, is that, in the Americas, countries gained their independence a lot sooner than other parts of the world. You have the United States in the 1776 declared independence, and then you have Haiti in the early 1800s, and then between around 1810 until around the 1830s, more or less, a lot of countries in the Spanish-speaking colonies gained their independence from Spain. Whereas in other parts of the world, with British colonies in Africa and the Middle East, and French colonies in Africa, for example, and in Asia too, a lot of these countries didn't gain their independence until the 20th century, the mid-20th century, right? The 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, even into the 1980s. And so coloniality is a way to describe how all the bullshit of colonialism was carried into the, independence. It's carried through independence and still exists to this day. So that's what coloniality in general means. So when it comes to prejudice versus discrimination, and this is something that someone who follows me on Instagram actually recommended and reminded me to talk about. So thank you if you're watching. How important it is for people to understand the difference between, individual prejudice and discrimination or discriminatory acts versus systemic racism. And so I want to touch on that now toward the end of this video. And it's important to get these to get these terms clear, right? There was a really short, very short, I don't even know if I would call it an article, it's more like a summary of articles by Simply Psychology. It's called Prejudice and Discrimination by Saul McLeod, I think is how you say their name. It's from 2008, and so this might be a little dated, but the first few paragraphs of this article that I'm linking down below just very succinctly and quickly covers the difference between prejudice and discrimination. And basically, I would boil it down to this. And again, if you want to reference or look at the article or find a good place to start, if you want to read into this more, the article I'm linking down below is a good place to start. Prejudice is basically the attitudes, biases, and beliefs, discrimination of an individual person, right? Discrimination is the behaviors and actions, right, that are fed by those beliefs, in a nutshell. And again, we're talking about at the level of the individual person or maybe the family unit. For example, I for the most part, grew up in rural, red state, conservative, Christian, predominantly white Kentucky. And so within my family unit, and my parents, they are racist and homophobic and transphobic, and they voted for Trump, okay? That's my family. And so within my family unit, I either explicitly or implicitly was taught a lot of racial bias, was taught a lot of prejudice against anything that wasn't heteronormative. Like, these are things that were fed to me based on my family unit, based on the culture I grew up in, right? And discrimination would be if I had carried out acts targeting certain groups of people based on the prejudiced beliefs and attitudes I had about, and stereotyped ideas I had about those groups of people, right? Whereas systemic racism is different. It's institutionalized, right? It's not dependent on the actions or attitudes or beliefs of just one person. It's an institutionalized racism that is upheld by people who have these prejudices, right? It's codified into law. Immigration law is a great, very clear-cut example of this. It's built into economic policies. It's built into how, like, schools, public schools in the United States are funded, for example. It's systemic. It's within the systems and institutions of the society, right? And it's important to point that out because that is kind of the linchpin of the argument about defunding or abolishing police as we know it, police forces in the United States, right? It's pointing out that systemically across the board, across time, the police force is a tool for upholding white supremacy in the United States and in other parts of the world too, right? And so I actually... another article that I'm linking down below, it's actually from Time magazine. It was written by Justin Warland, came out just a few days ago. It's called America's Long Overdue Awakening to Systemic Racism. And the writer, the author, includes a really clear, just really great paragraph that I'm actually going to share with you guys because it kind of gets straight to the point of how systemic racism then affects the everyday lives and threatens the health and well-being of people, right? And it's just a really great article because I think it expresses some of the frustration because these conversations aren't new, but for some reason, and maybe we can dive into this in a later video, but it seems like more and more white people are finally willing to open their eyes to it and do something about it. But anyway, let me find this specific paragraph I wanted to talk about. And this is just one of many paragraphs that the author includes that provides very clear examples of systemic racism. So, quote, to actually capture all the ways in which the system is skewed against black people would require tome upon tome, but even a short list feels very long. Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely as white women to die in childbirth, in part because of a lack of access to quality health care. Black children are more likely to attend under-resourced schools, thanks to a reliance on local property taxes for funding. Black voters are 4 times as likely as white voters to report difficulties voting or engaging in politics than their white counterparts, in part because of laws that even today are designed to keep them from exercising their basic democratic rights. Millions more have been disenfranchised because of felony convictions. Hurricane flooding has been known or shown to hit black neighborhoods disproportionately. And so that's, like the author said, even a short list can feel way too long. Just all this human suffering that's built into our institutions and also into our very national identity, and so I think if you want to learn more or read more about what that author has to say about systemic racism and why it seems like maybe just enough white people might finally be fucking waking up to it, I've included that down below. So that article's down below. The psychology article, or very short article talking about prejudice versus discrimination, is down below. I also am including I think this is a blog post. Let me pull it up. So this is actually a blog post from the Council on Foreign Relations. It's written by John Campbell and Jack McCaslin, and it's called "George Floyd's Murder Revives Anti-Colonialism in Western Europe," and it's a very short blog or article, just 3 or 4 longer paragraphs, and it talks about the reawakening of the conversation of colonialism and anti-colonialism in relation to the police brutality and anti-black racism in the United States, and how that conversation is kind of being revived within Europe. And I know I have a lot of people on my channel, viewers, that live in Europe, and so that might be an interesting resource or a piece to kind of read and kind of chew on for a bit, specifically for white people in Europe, right? So that is linked down below. I also have linked down below a YouTube video. It's around 20 minutes or so, and it's actually by Jazeera English, and it's a conversation about how does colonialism shape the world we live in. And the 2 hosts of the program kind of interview 3 professors who focus on different parts of the world and do anti-colonial research and work, and just talking about how colonialism continues to shape the world we live in and continues to shape our lives. And so that is a really, really great place to start. If you feel kind of overwhelmed, like, whoa, colonialism, okay, where do I start? Just listening to what these professors have to say, listening to what the hosts of the program have to say and the conversation that they have, it's just really, really interesting and a great place to start. So I'm linking that down below, and also in the description box for every single video of this series, I'm linking down below an excellent website where you can go to try to do what you can to support Black Lives Matter. It's a great little hub where, if you want to directly donate money to the victims' families, you can do that. There's resources. If you are outside of the United States, there's a whole section for how you can donate and send resources to where they're needed from outside of the U.S. That's how I came across it and use it. And so I'm going to include that link in the description box under every video of this series. So please check out the resources down below. And thank you so much for the people who showed interest in this series. I hope I can do this conversation justice and share my knowledge and give people a direction to go so we can keep educating ourselves about just how really pernicious and white supremacy, it's in the air we breathe. Colonialism and white supremacy, I'll end this video with this. So a few years ago, I was taking a class on performance theory, which is another body of knowledge that can be used for anti-colonial work. And for the class, we read a theory book, and then when the author of the book, who was a professor at the university, came and talked to us. And this was a professor who specialized in post-Civil War U.S. history, specifically focusing on race and how, like, the construction of race and racism after the Civil War in the U.S. And this professor said something that always struck me. And she said, you know, in many ways we're still living in the 19th century when it comes to just how extensive and, you know, just how extensive and, oh man, I don't even know how to describe it, but ubiquitous, I guess, systemic racism is in the United States, and how she was pointing to the end of the 19th century, or the 19th century in general, for that. But I would actually kind of argue that in many ways we're still living in the 16th century, and we're living in the wake of the power structures that were set up in the 16th century, in the 1500s, right? As Spain and Portugal started setting up their empires, and then later on down the road in the 17th and 18th centuries, you have other European powers trying to set up their empires, and also participating in the Atlantic slave trade, and, you know, colonizing other parts of the world as well. So I just want to leave you with that kind of thought experiment. How modern are we really? If in many ways we're still living in the 16th century, or we're living in the world that is the result of, you know, Western colonialism of the last 500 years. So I'll leave you with that. The next video, I want to kind of unpack whiteness. I have a feeling that actually that's going to require a couple of videos at least, just kind of unpacking whiteness and where whiteness comes from, and then also white supremacy. And if you have any suggestions, if you have any resources you would like to share, if you have any comments or feedback, please comment down below. Be part of the conversation. If you feel like I've left something out, or if you yourself like have something to contribute, please do a VR. You know, comment down below, share resources. You know, let's decolonize this world together and fuck racism. So yeah, until next time, I wish you peace and justice and health and well-being. Yeah, I'll see you later. Bye.